זהו, התחלנו להקליט, יש לנו כבר 20 ומשהו אנשים, ועוד 2 דקות, אז תגיד להם באנגלית יפה שבעוד 2 דקות אנחנו מתחילים.
All right, we will begin this Zoom presentation in the next 2 minutes. So stay tuned. We'll be starting momentarily. One. Thank you. Isn't it 8 o'clock? Okay, let me start. Okay, good evening, everyone. My name is Yehuda Singer. I am a certified Israeli tour guide, for those who don't know me. And I decided tonight we would be speaking about Dead Sea Scrolls and the Qumran community, which just so happens to be a 15-minute ride from my house in Mitzpeh Richo. I find this a very exciting topic because every time I look at material that's written about the topic, I learn something new and exciting. So let's hear what we can cover today. Okay, what is the genre in the DSS stands for Dead Sea Scrolls, and what is included in it? You have the biblical canon, right? All books except for the book of Esther. These are divinely inspired works. The Apocrypha, the book of Enoch, Hanoch in Hebrew, Jubilee, Ben Sira, Genesis, Apocrypha. And sectarian works like the Manual of Discipline, Sharim, War Scroll, Temple Scroll, Thanksgiving, Psalms, and etc. The language that these scrolls are written in are mostly in Hebrew, with some written in Aramaic. Those that are written in Aramaic predate Qumran, as the nationalistic sentiment of the Hasmonean era resulted in a resurgence in Hebrew as a language of composition for religious literature. And a few of the scrolls in Greek. No book of Esther. There's a dispute about this. Dispute whether the people in the Qumran community observe the holiday of Purim, or it just so happens that it may have fallen out. There may have been a small piece from that book, and it was lost in the excavations. What happens? There is no Gospels in the Dead Sea Scrolls, because these scrolls were authored prior to the advent of John the Baptist and Jesus, for that matter. The other thing that's important to know is prior to this discovery, the earliest codex that we had on the Bible was from around the year 1000. This is like 1,000 years older than any other previously discovered manuscript. The Apocrypha are similar to biblical books, about biblical books, and related to biblical books. These, like the biblical books, were not authored by those who lived in Qumran and were not necessarily copied there. They represented works read by Jews throughout the country. Works like this were found in Metzada, which was subsequently destroyed in the year 73, Common Era, by the Romans. These books in the The 960 some odd scrolls or fragments date from about the year 300 before the Common Era to approximately 68 CE was when they date the destruction of Qumran, which appeared in the Septuagint and Vulgate versions, but not in the Hebrew Bible. Most are accepted by the Roman Catholic and Orthodox churches as the Deuterocanonical books. To make it very interesting, we have an anomaly. The story of Hanukkah, which is recorded in 1st and 2nd book of Maccabees, does not appear in the Hebrew Bible, while it does appear in the Septuagint and in the Catholic Bible. The Qumran sectarian scrolls, written by the sectarians who most scholars identify with the Essenes, as described by Philo and Josephus. These works, including the particular religious teachings of the group, for example, about predestination, light and darkness imagery, messianism, variety of prayer and rituals, etc., that are peculiar to this particular group of Jews. We also have the Manual of Discipline. Those are the community rules in Qumran, describing how a person gains admission to the community and advances through its ranks, places intensive study of Mosaic scriptures and the communal laws, deriving from those scriptures at the center of its elite self-understanding and differentiation for the rest of Israel. Most noteworthy is the concern for ritual purity by immersion and the discovery of nearly 10 ritual baths, mikvaot at Qumran. It's an example, it takes up 17% of the surface area in Qumran are ritual baths. Sharim, these which systematically employ explicit scriptural commentary to prophetic texts to trace the sacred history of the community as the privileged fulfillment of prophetic predictions. I want to say this again. This is, as Larry Schiffman, Professor Larry Lawrence Schiffman said, it's contemporizing biblical interpretation. The prophecy was not meant for the generation in which it was pronounced. Verses from the biblical book of Nahum were not written for his age, but really for the the generation in which the teacher of righteousness of this generation of the sectarians was able to explain it to his generation, and it was apropos to his generation. The War Scroll talks about the sons of light versus the sons of darkness. It's about apocalypse. It's all about dualism. The world is coming to an end, and these people felt the immediacy of it, and they actually everybody was waiting for some kind of messianic personality to appear on the scene. The book, another sectarian work, the Temple Scroll, describes a Jewish temple which was never built, along with extensive detailed regulations about sacrifices and temple practices. The dimensions of the temple are much larger than the Solomonic first temple, probably reflecting the significantly larger population whose needs must be met. This clearly means that the scroll predates the dramatic expansion of the Second Temple, sometimes referred to as Herod's Temple, which Herod the Great instituted to meet those same needs which had been generated by significant population growth. Coming to modern times, May 1967, Kondo, who was the one who bought, we were going to run across him, bought these scrolls from the boys who discovered them, tries to sell this under a bridge in Beirut. And we'll talk about that later. The Thanksgiving Psalms of 40 additional inspired psalms attributed to David. Sense of asceticism is not characteristic of Pharisees, but rather of Christianity. Moving on. Let's go back. It really doesn't, the story which we're going to mention in the next slide of 1947 really begins in 1898. There were two women in 1896, Agnes Smith Lewis and Margaret Dunlop Gibson, the identical twin daughters of a worldly Scottish widower, returned to Cambridge from a trip to the Middle East, bearing pages from several ancient Hebrew manuscripts that they had purchased from a Cairo bookseller. They showed the parchment leaves to a fellow Cambridge University scholar named Solomon Schechter, who was startled to discover among them an original copy of the Hebrew Proverbs of Ben Sira, a 2nd century BCE Hebrew book of wisdom. You must remember what was in the Septuagint was in Greek. This is the first time they discovered the original in Hebrew. To this day, synagogues collect damaged prayer books and unfit ritual objects and bury the context every few years, or in the case of the Ben Ezra synagogue in Fustat, place them in a room, Geniza room, not to be used. Okay, now we're up to where the story typically begins when you visit the site. The discovery in 1947 by two Bedouin shepherd boys. You see Muhammad Dib and his cousin. Muhammad returned to the caves by himself. Originally, 10 jars and 3 scrolls were found in cave 1. These ancient scrolls were hanging. They subsequently hung them in the Bedouin tent until someone took them to see if they were worth anything in Bethlehem. The Dead Sea Scrolls that were found were originally preserved by the dry, arid, and low humidity conditions present within the Qumran area adjoining the Dead Sea. In addition, the lack of the use of tanning materials on the parchment of the Dead Sea Scrolls and the very low airflow in the Qumran caves also contributed significantly to their preservation. Some of the scrolls were found stored in clay jars, as you see in the slide to the right, within the Qumran caves, further helping to preserve them from deterioration. That's in the first cave. Kondo. This is Kondo purchased the scrolls and sold, out of the 7 originals, he sold 4 to the Metropolitan Archbishop of Jerusalem named Mar Athanasius Samuel for a good profit. John Trevor recently completed his PhD doing research at Asor in Jerusalem, examined the 3 scrolls which the Bedouin found inside the jar and realized their importance and photographed them. The Archbishop prohibited the opening of the Genesis Apocryphal scroll because of its brittle state. At the end of March 1948, keep in mind that in 47, November, there was a vote in the United Nations for a separate Arab and separate Jewish state. And this already, civil war broke out in the area. The end of March 48, the Archbishop left for New York with 4 scrolls, tried to sell them, but no one would buy them. Why no interested buyers? 1, in the meantime, these 3 scholars published the contents. The information was made public. So that's what most people were interested in, the information. 2, unclear legal status. They might be ordered by the courts to return them to the Middle East. War of Independence, like we talked, breaks out in May 15, 1948. Well, this is Eliezer Lipa Sukenik. Professor Sukenik's archaeological career took off when there was an accidental discovery of the Beit Alpha Synagogue, which many of you visited in the Beit Shan Valley. And it's an exquisite mosaic, while bulldozing the area to build a new kibbutz dining room in 1928. He happens to fall, his son, Yigal Yadin, changes his name into Hebrew name, is the chief of staff and advisor to the prime minister. So he's in the United States. He eventually gets a hold of the scrolls. So now Professor Sukenik has all 7 in the 1950s. Okay. John Trevor, we mentioned him previously, examines 3 scrolls which the Bedouin found inside the jar and realized their importance, and he photographs them. In the meantime, initial military clashes took place in Jerusalem between Jews and Arabs, which escalated into Israel War of Independence. Right here is a map, and you see that between 1949 and 1957, that the Bedouin are going through this part of the desert, everywhere from North all the way down to Masada, and are raking it, looking for any kind of scrolls, and they're going through all the caves. And so different scrolls come up, like down towards closer to Masada. We have Moribat, they find in Nachal Cheber. The last few where they find scrolls that relate to the Bar Kokhba revolt. But the ones over here in the upper section, those particularly near Qumran, are related to the Qumran sectarian group. This is the area in the Rockefeller Museum where they put the very brittle and very these scrolls underneath glass. In the early days of the Dead Sea Scroll studies, scholars with direct access to the scrolls were in the habit of taking matters literally into their own hands. Sometimes this resulted in fairly crude physical repairs that did more harm than good. Other scholars worked indirectly using scissors and tape to cut up and reassemble photographic prints or transparencies of scrolls. Not surprisingly, direct or indirect repairs always lacked precision and on occasion even hid more information than they revealed. John Mecro Allegro is examining the copper scroll. That was the only scroll that wasn't made out of parchment from animals or from papyrus. This was made out of a copper scroll. This is on. This is in the museum in Jordan. The copper scroll text describes 63 treasure troves hidden in various places in the region of Jerusalem and the northern part of the Judean desert. The task of cutting the first roll of the copper scroll was a very important one, not only because it was one that had not been previously carried out, but also because it was being performed on artifacts that are unique and irreplaceable. Had the task failed, those who carried it out would have had to shoulder the opprobrium entailed. The opening of the copper scroll not only required technical excellence, but courage as well. Strangely, it was not carried out on site, but in Manchester, England. Shortly after the scroll was opened, the Jordanian government gave John Allegro permission to search for these treasures. Result, no treasure was found. Scholars are still divided whether the descriptions in the copper scroll were genuine or fictional accounts. Those who believe they were real, since the description of hiding places is real, while those who were skeptical claim that the huge sums prove that it is an imaginative descriptions. Archaeologists Guy Stable. Hold on. Is it? Okay.
Are these the Dead Sea Scrolls?
These are the Dead Sea Scrolls, and this is the place where they were found, and that's why it's so exciting. There is a story, you can see the people behind them. You can see this man running for 3 kilometers from Qumran with a scroll that described his dream, his temple. The Romans were coming. But he wanted future generation to read it. I don't know his name, but he managed to pass it on 2,000 years ago. There are hundreds of caves, but very few with actually artifacts or more important documents in it. And let's see it. Come. I do apologize for the atmosphere and the smell, but this is what the real stuff smells like. In this cave, in the early 1950s, the longest and best preserved scroll was found. We call it the Temple Scroll, and it was 8 meters, 15 centimeters long. 2,000 years old parchment with ink letters that my kids can read today. Yes, of course, they're the most gifted kids on earth, but the communities that we're going to speak about is known as the Essenes. It's a group of priests, highly educated, so educated that they wrote. They were obsessed with writing. They went to the desert because they were thrown away from Jerusalem. They were thrown away from the temple. So we speak about elite people, educated intellectuals that were bitter. Actually, when you read the script, and excuse my language, they were pissed off with the rest of the world. And they were waiting for, like what we have in Christianity, Armageddon. And leave Bruce Willis aside, we're going to speak about the war of good against evil. And they're going to fight everyone else, not only the Greeks or the Romans, they're going to fight even Jews, that everyone that is not following their way of thinking. So when you read about them, be careful. What was found here was a temple scroll, and this was a manifest, actually, because this group of priests were thrown from Jerusalem. For them, Jerusalem became impure, and their way was actually to destroy the place and rebuild it. And what we have on 8 meters and 15 centimeters is their vision, architectural vision of how the temple should look like. And for us, it's a present. This is just a dream, but the dream is filled with details about them, their scripts, about the law of the community, and even some gossips about politics of 2,000 years ago, about their hopes, about their fears. And the fact that you can go beyond the matter and speak about the spirit is something that is so very rare in our profession. This is why, for me, I couldn't help myself in dragging you up here just that you smell it, but understand that we walked up. For us, the discovery of this scroll was changing our mind beyond all the details, and this scroll, for example, means the world for us. It really utterly changed our view about life back then, about the temple. And archaeologists, historians, students of religion, just name it. I mean, I think everyone that deals with that period of time in this part of land consult the script.
How did you decide to become an archaeologist?
I should actually ask my mother, I guess. But it started, I think, with curiosity. Basically, it's curiosity. At the end of the day, I think it's the soil, it's being out in the desert.
Okay, that was archaeologist Guy Stiebel, and I'm very happy I found this. He's a senior lecturer in the Department of Archaeology and Ancient Near Eastern Cultures in Tel Aviv University, and he heads the archaeological expedition to the World Heritage Site at Masada. Presently. He earned his PhD for the study of militaria in Roman Palestine and held a postdoctoral position in the Hebrew University for the study of realia of the Dead Sea War Scroll. That's how his relevancy to us. Okay. The Rockefeller Museum was built during the British Mandate in 1938 and was the major museum of antiquities in Palestine. The museum maintained its international status till 1966 when the Jordanians decided to nationalize it. After the 1967 war, Israel took over the management of the museum, and the Israel Antiquities Authority's offices were housed there. The archaeological artifacts, the library, and displays remained in place until the beginning of the 21st century. So I want to read here because I thought it was so. During the Six-Day War, Yadin, military advisor to Prime Minister Levi Eshkol, asked military intelligence to search Kondo's home for the Temple Scroll. Remember, we talked about him paying $10,000 under a bridge. He had someone front for him, and he never got anything. Well, guess what they found under the floorboards? They found this scroll, except it was quite damaged. More damage occurred from it being in these poor conditions underneath the floorboards than over the last 1,900 years in the desert. After the war, the Israeli government settles with Kondo and pays him something like $125,000. Okay, this building was constructed. It's very beautiful. It has a lot of meaning. You see the white part of the shaped as a one of the jars, and in the back is a big black wall. This is representative of the war against the children of light and the children of darkness. Okay. Controversies surrounding the delay in publications. What you see here is Cave 4. This, if anybody has visited the Qumran site, this is what you see. You see Cave 4, 4A and 4B, which there were close to 16,000 small little fragments that boil down to about 137 biblical manuscripts that pieced together. Manuel Tov. Okay. John Strugnell led the publication team from 1987 to 1990. When scholars not on the official team requested to view the manuscripts in 1989, they were denied access. This was perceived by onlookers as evidence that scrolls had been taken into the exclusive control of an academic and ecclesiastical elite. Herschel Shanks from the Biblical Archaeology Review magazine championed the immediate release of the scrolls. Public pressure on not only Strugnell, but on the IAA. Embarrassed by the negative exposure, they first assigned Emmanuel Tov to work alongside Strugnell. Eventually, they removed Strugnell in 1990 and replaced him with a triumvirate. Emmanuel Tov, who served as the chair, Emile Huer, a French priest who had long-standing tradition of scrolls research at the École Biblique, I can't pronounce it, and Eugene Ulrich of the University of Notre Dame. The results, since 1990, over 30 volumes of discoveries in the Judean desert have been published. Who composed these scrolls? Both Josephus, the first century Jewish historian, and the first century Gentile historian Pliny the Elder mentioned the sect living north of the Dead Sea. They called them Essenes. Most scholars have assumed that the manuscripts hidden in the caves were the library of a religious community who lived at the site. Many of the scrolls are notably critical of the Jerusalem priesthood. They include multiple copies of rule books for distinct associations and other literature of a sectarian character. They conspicuously lack literature that could be identified as Pharisee, the forerunners of the Talmudic rabbis. While the scrolls contain many texts, including the biblical ones that circulated widely, the collection as a whole has a sectarian character. But even if the scrolls are a sectarian collection, it does not follow that they were all composed and used at Qumran. They could have been brought there from other sectarian communities for safekeeping in the face of the advance of the Roman army. Who lived there in Qumran? When and what kind of life did they lead? The Yachad community, as they are called in these scrolls, depicted in the scroll, has distinctive sociological, political, and religious, theological, and halachic attributes. One significant characteristic is its communal lifestyle. The sect distanced themselves from the rest of society and from Jerusalem's city life. The members of the Dead Sea sect did not retain full ownership of personal possessions. Individuals swore to devote their wealth, along with all their physical and mental strength, to the Yachad community. In addition to the sharp division between the members of the community and outsiders, there was a strict hierarchy within the group. The priests, and especially the sons of Tzadok, are awarded the highest status, though the makeup of the leadership seems to have changed over time. While the sect appears to have permitted marriage, as is mentioned in the Damascus document, right? Some texts indicate that there were members who refrained from marrying at all, like in the community rule, in which women are not mentioned at all. Seems to have such people in mind. As I mentioned before, Professor Lawrence Schiffman, an authority, says the U.S. Constitution also doesn't mention females, and by no means were they excluded. The Hebrew Bible is viewed by the Talmudic rabbis as having been divinely inspired. The Torah, prophets, and writing in descending order of inspiration. In contradistinction, the Qumran sectarian group felt that some modicum of prophecy remained with them and their leadership. What was the central idea which held together the entire system, and what was the self-image underlying it? They viewed themselves as if they are angel-like priestly community, or members of the Qumran movement were connected to the angels because they emulated them. What are the reasons for those scholars who believe they identify the scrolls with the settlement? One, the proximity of caves to the settlement, especially Cave 4. The inkwells found at the site, which suggests that scribal activity was carried out there. So-called Yachad Ostrakhan, a deed of gift, which appears to involve handling over private property, people who were candidates, to the community, which was called Yachad. The distinctive types of pottery found in the caves and at the settlement. Archaeological evidence of precautions to preserve ritual purity in keeping with the emphasis on ritual purity in the sectarian scrolls. These include the extensive water systems, the cylindrical pottery, and the number and variety of stone vessels, which are not susceptible to impurity. The cemetery. The burial customs and grave forms at Qumran are fundamentally different from those practiced by normative Judaism in Jerusalem, Jericho, and En-Gedi. The majority of the 1,200 graves are aligned very neatly with the heads to the south and the feet to the north, facing Jerusalem. The large number of dining utensils in the pantry suggests that communal meals were held there. That said, much, but not necessarily all, of the non-sectarian literature dates from a time before the rise of the movement described in the sectarian rulebooks. This seems to be the case with much, but not necessarily all, of the literature composed in Aramaic. Conclusion. I'm going to complete, and then afterwards there'll be a few slides that are on other topics. You'll see. From a book, a paper called Current Issues in Dead Sea Scrolls by Timothy Lynn and John Collins. It is in the nature of scholarship that results are seldom, if ever, definitive. New evidence comes to light. New perspective change our perspectives change our perception of old problems. The study of the Dead Sea Scrolls enjoyed a remarkable consensus for a long time, roughly from the mid-1950s to the mid-1990s. That consensus viewed the scrolls as the library of a quasi-monastic settlement that lived at Qumran. It was formed on the basis of a much smaller corpus of scrolls than what is now available. Inevitably, the new evidence would reopen old questions and give rise to new ones. It is now the case that all aspects of the old consensus, it is not the case that all aspects of the old consensus were necessarily wrong. Most scholars still believe that Qumran was a sectarian site and that the people who occupied it were most probably Essenes. But if these elements of the consensus prevail, the consensus can no longer be viewed only in the context of the Qumran settlement. The sectarian movement was more widely dispersed, and there is more in the scrolls and relates more broadly to Judaism of the day. It is apparent that the scrolls have more to say about the role of women than was initially supposed, on the basis of a too fragile facile reading of the Essene hypothesis. While the early decades of scroll scholarship were largely concerned with the implications of the scrolls for Christianity, the last quarter of a century or so has seen great advances in the understanding of how they relate to rabbinic Judaism. Okay, I said that's basically covering the topic, but I want to show you we have other items that just popped up when I was searching down the topic. Let's see what they're all about. I call them the appendices. NASA photography. To the naked eye, the fragment appears to have been completely ruined over time, with any vestige of text obliterated. Film-based infrared photography recently reveals a series of large, illegible characters in one of the fragments. As you can see, the infrared, this new type of state-of-the-art, has brought little fragments, have shown the text, as you see on the right-hand side. Copyright disputes. I'm quoting back in the 1990s, where someone published a book called Freeing the Dead Sea Scrolls. I'll read, it was written in the New York Times back then in the 1990s. The first volume of the reconstructed text has just been published by the Biblical Archaeology Society of Washington, D.C. More will be forthcoming as the researchers press on with their work. Amazingly, 2 scholars at the Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati have now broken the scroll cartel. These men are to be applauded for their work. The committee, with its obsessive secrecy and cloak and dagger scholarship, long ago exhausted its credibility with scholars and laymen alike. Give you a bit of the cloak and dagger and the what's going on. Okay. How about this one? The Qumran controversy took a bizarre turn when scholar Norman Gold's son, Raphael, was arrested on charges of identity theft, criminal impersonation, and aggravated harassment. In a statement, the New York District Attorney's Office says that Raphael engaged in a systematic scheme on the internet using dozens of internet aliases in order to influence and affect debate on the Dead Sea Scrolls and in order to harass Dead Sea Scroll scholars who disputed his father's findings. The alleged target was Gold's old rival, Lawrence Schiffman, Norman Gold always maintained that scrolls in this number could only have originated in Jerusalem and that they were taken to the desert for hiding. Khirbat Qumran was no monastic-like center. It was a military fortress, according to Gold, that belonged to the nexus of defensive posts guarding the eastern front of Judea. The scrolls then are a random sample of the Jewish literature of the time. In that case, their proximity to the ruins of Qumran was mere coincidence. Like it says on the slide, defendant was sentenced to 6 months in jail and 5 years of probation on the identity of theft counts and to concurrent lesser terms on the remaining counts. And for our last slide, forgeries. In 2018, this has just come up now, but it's in the news recently. In 2018, German-based scholars tested the 5 of the Bible Museum's fragments and said they show characteristic inconsistency with their ancient origin. To make convincing forgeries, the forgers coated the scraps with a shiny amber material, most likely animal glue, to fix tears and match the waxy sheen of authentic Dead Sea Scroll fragments. The report says, remarkably, despite being bought from 4 different sellers, all were coated by the same amber material, suggesting the forgeries may have come from the same hand. Among the forger's errors, according to the report, was in using modern ink to write snippets from the Bible on the ancient scraps, according to an analysis by German labs. And the writing itself bore clues. Letters appeared to follow the creases and the tears of the ancient leather, and an indication that someone was trying hard to write on the uneven surfaces. While the ink was still wet, the forgers scattered variety of loose mineral deposits consistent with the Dead Sea region. To confirm the forgery, the 6-member advisory team hired by the museum used a superhero-esque array of gadgetry, including 3D microscopes, infrared spectroscopy, and energy dispersive X-ray analysis. Okay, that was, now I have to unlock the thing. Hold on, let me see if I can do this. All right, I'm going to hold on, I'm going to unmute, let's see. Hold on, unmute all, here we go. I'm unmuting everybody. If anybody has any comments, questions, we'll try to do the best to answer. I'm thankful for everybody's patience. It was a long haul. Anybody want to speak up? I think I unmuted. Oh, here I go, unmute all, unmuted. Everybody's unmuted. Anybody? Wait, let me see. Edna? And I keep on doing unmute and I don't know if I succeed. I'm trying to unmute. I want to unmute all. I keep on pressing. Oh, so only he can unmute? Oh. So what can I do? I can't.
יהודה, אתה פשוט צריך לסיים את השיחה.
כן, רציתי שתפתח לכם את הזה. הבנת? אני רציתי שאתה עושה unmute. צחי?
אני לא מבין, מה אתה אומר?
אתה צריך לעשות unmute.
לכל המשתתפים.
יש לך את ה...
אם מישהו רוצה לשאול שאלות.
מישהו רוצה לשאול שאלות.
אתה ההוסט, אתה עושה את ה...
אני ניסיתי, לא הצליח.
לא, כי בעיקרון הם יכולים לשלוח בצ'אט. הם לא יכולים...
בצ'אט שלחו לי תודה. הם לא יכולים להגיד.
לא?
כן, שלחו תודה בצ'אט.
אוקיי, אוקיי.
תודה.
תודה רבה. Thank you everybody for hanging with us. It's my pleasure. תודה רבה. Hello? Anybody there?
זהו, אתה רק צריך לנתק את לצאת מה...
All right, say it. I'm gonna say end.
אין, בדיוק. אין for all.